Good morning and welcome back to another We Are Sunderland morning briefing in partnership with the Farm Museum and Cospex Opticians. Now, just a little bit of furniture. Obviously, We Are Sunderland's now live. You can head over there and take advantage of our launch offer. It's £1 for just 6 months of subscription. Today, I'm joined by Connor, who's Chief Norwich reporter for the Pink. And how are you doing?
Hello, mate. Yeah, I'm not too bad. Not too bad. How probably a lot more fresh than you are, I'd imagine, after the last few weeks.
Yeah, I would say chaotic, but I think that's probably underplaying things a little bit. But yeah, so just obviously on the game, before we get into the game at the weekend, how's the season gone so far for the Canaries? Obviously, they are just 3 points outside the playoffs, but was that the aim, would you say, at the start of the season?
Definitely the club aim. Yeah, I think the club aim was to try and get inside the top six. And there was probably a degree of confidence that they could do that. They recruited perhaps in a slightly different way. They recruited more experience. They signed like Ashley Barnes and Shane Duffy, and that was all geared towards giving them a little bit more solidity and also know-how to approach the championship. And yeah, it's been a really funny season. Like you guys probably, it's felt about 4 seasons in one,
Yeah.
through various aspects of it. They had a really positive start and found themselves in the top 2 pretty early on, and then absolutely fell off a cliff. Because of injuries partly, but there were other factors in that as well. Some tactical decisions. David Wagner, particularly after the defeat of the Stadium of Light in the reverse game, it felt like he was really on the brink. And actually, I was watching him after his or during his post-match interview that day, and it felt like a man that was basically waiting to be put out of his misery. Then they went and got beat by Blackburn a week later at Carrow Road, and there was toxicity, and that really did feel like the end at that point. It still wasn't. They kept with him, and there's been a change of sporting director in the background. Stuart Webber's left, and Ben Napper, who was working as loans manager at Arsenal, has come in, and that probably bought him a little bit of time. And since that point, really, they've really recovered, and I think they've had 4 defeats since they beat Cardiff just before the November international break, and they've gone from 17th in the table as they were after that Blackburn game now up to 7th. So they're in a nice rhythm. Their home form's really improved. They're unbeaten in 10 in all competitions at Carrow Road. So yeah, they're in a good place, but I'd still say there's this uncertainty around David Wagner and the direction of travel that they're going in the long term. But there does feel like there's been a little bit of a truce now just to try and pull together for the final 12 games. So yeah, that was a real brief roadmap of the season, but it's been really topsy-turvy, to be honest.
It's interesting because I remember obviously when David Wagner went in last year, Norwich, but by all means, they didn't have the best of seasons. But was that sort of a grace period, you think, that he was given, obviously from January until the end of last season?
Yeah, I think it was, and I think there was a feeling that obviously a lot of the players weren't his players. They maybe weren't completely aware of his system and what he was trying to do with it, and also probably a desire to see, and this was partly why there was so much resentment towards Dean Smith. Style of play that kind of went across what they were trying to do, and there was a feeling that he could implement that, and that he was the person to kind of replicate what he did at Huddersfield, really, in terms of high intensity, high aggression, and again, that hasn't really happened this season in the way that perhaps the supporters would like. So they ended last season with a run, I think, of 1 win in 11. They had a run this season of 7 defeats in 9. And as you guys know yourself, for a head coach, those type of runs don't really get forgotten, even when you're in the position that he is now, and you've kind of rescued it a little bit. And I think it's 1 defeat in 10 at this moment in time. The defeat, or it wasn't a defeat, sorry, it was a draw at Blackburn at the weekend, has kind of dragged up some of that feeling that has kind of been bubbling under the surface towards him, that many people maybe feel he's not long-term best suited to drive Norwich City forward.
It's interesting that you say that because obviously Sunderland were in a situation with Michael Beale. Obviously, they've since parted ways, but it felt like he was very much in a similar sort of boat in terms of, he'd win a couple of games, then as soon as he'd lose, all the sort of baggage in the background would resurface. Obviously, you won't know the ins and outs of the Sunderland situation, but from a Norwich point of view, do you feel like that's something that the Championship itself sort of does?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like, and I speak to a lot of opposition journalists and a lot of people who cover teams, and it feels like, to be honest, the vast majority of Championship clubs feel like they're in crisis. I think that's the way it's felt at Norwich at points, and I've summed it up in videos and podcasts that we've done. It feels like a club that's kind of 1 defeat from a crisis, and probably still feels like that now, and that's kind of what it's felt like at other Championship clubs. I mean, you mentioned Sunderland, and I said it to you off air, but after that game at the Stadium of Light, I walked away thinking, well, they're an absolute shoe-in for the top six under Tony Mowbray, and what's happened since. So it is a funny league, and I think it has a funny way of when you think you've cracked it and you think you're onto something, it just catches you with one like a surprise one on the chin, and equally when you think that all hope is lost, it's got a good way of reminding you that actually it isn't. And I think, as we said, because of how long it is, 46 games, and because you can go through so many highs and lows, and even at the real troughs of it, that doesn't necessarily dictate where you're going to finish, and equally the peaks of it don't necessarily dictate where you're going to finish. So I think because of the emotions and because of obviously the climate of modern football, we see a lot more reactivity and probably short-termism now than we ever have. But you're right, there is definitely this kind of feeling that the Championship at the moment is as in flux, I think, as it ever has been. And that's not aided, I think, by perhaps the parachute payments and all of these kind of different political stuff that we could bring into it. But yeah, it's a really funny old league at the best of times, I think.
Yeah, it certainly is, especially when you look at how tight, obviously, it is, and the amount of teams that are vying for promotion. If I take you back to the obviously the last meeting between the two sides, Norwich took the lead at the Stadium of Light, but obviously turnaround in the second half was obviously complete. What do you think went wrong for Norwich on that day?
I think it kind of encapsulated all of the issues that they had in that really bad spell of run they had. Limited options in terms of the squad. They were without Josh Sargent for a long portion, and he's obviously come back and done what he's done, and I think it's evident that he was a real miss for him. So again, it was a factor, wasn't the only factor, but this was the point in time where I think Wagner was trying to play a system that was too open. For example, they had both of their fullbacks push really high all of the time, so they were too open and got done in transition a lot. But there was also a chronic lack of confidence in what they were trying to do, and I think they basically post Sunderland, post Blackburn, then they had a win at Cardiff where they came from behind and won, and from there they kind of went back to basics and tweaked little things. They had really kind of large inquests in that November international break about what they could do, because they were essentially in a position where they had to score 3 goals a game to get anything out of it, and we both know that's just not sustainable. So they had to change and they had to be different. And Sunderland was in the run, I think, where they were, I don't want to say they were in crisis, but certainly on the pitch there was a real lack of energy, plan, but also confidence in the plan that they did have. And for Sunderland, it was probably a game too far, and the quality of Clark and Bellingham and the kind of attacking players, Dan Neil as well, that you guys had was just too strong for Norwich on the day. And what they've done subsequently has made themselves a lot tougher to beat and probably play games on finer margins. So that's probably aided them, I would say, because they've got players who can kind of produce moments of quality rather than probably consistent kind of passages of play and spells of dominance within games. So I'd say all of those factors really, but I just felt looking at it that day that it was just Norwich City getting beaten by a team that was superior to them, if I'm completely honest.
Yeah, I mean, so it's fair. Would you say they've taken a bit more of a pragmatic approach to obviously how they approach games?
Yeah, definitely. As I said, it's been a real evolution. I think they for a period, certainly throughout January and from that November spell that they had, the emphasis was then on defensively and trying to ensure that they were a little bit more solid. And they've kind of got down a rate of conceding 2 goals a game, and they've halved it. So it's now about 1 a game since that point. So there has been real defensive improvement. And again, it's been really basic stuff that they've done. Instead of having both fullbacks push forward, they've maybe only had 1 and kept 1 back. They've played with a bit more of a 6. So they found a little bit more balance, but then they found in kind of mid-January that as they were getting more pragmatic, they were losing some of the attacking quality that they had. So they had to find a kind of readdress that balance, and it felt like they've done that. And prior to the draw at Blackburn, they had 2 really good wins at Carrow Road. They beat Watford 4-2 and beat Cardiff 4-1. So it does feel like they've achieved a better balance now between those 2 states. But I think there is still this defensive vulnerability that's hard to ignore, and there is still this slight over-reliance on moments of quality. So if you can, as Blackburn proved, if you can nullify that, then I think there's still a real ability to get to this Norwich City team.
When you look at obviously the form table as a whole, unbeaten in 5, is it fair to say that do you think they're hitting form at the right sort of time?
Yes, I think there's maybe a fear that they're hitting form a little bit too early as well, and they did kind of do this to an extent last season as well. They beat Millwall. I can't remember the exact date, but it was sometime in March, and that pushed them into the top 6 under Wagner. That they only then won one game for the rest of the season after that, and that kind of curtailed their playoff push. So I think the fear is that they have gone a little bit too early, and that at some point they're going to kind of come down. These things work in waves. We know how it goes. They've got a striker in Josh Sargent who prior to the weekend was scoring a goal every 80 minutes. That's not a sustainable rate of scoring goals. And there are players who are hitting runs of form as well. They've lost John Rowe until April in the last couple of weeks. So I think there is maybe a fear that they might have gone too early, but definitely it's hard to argue that a lot of the work that they've had to do in the last few months has been kind of to get themselves into this position. Now they've almost got to find another gear to go again and to push themselves in the top 6. So it is tough. And I would say also there's been a massive difference between their home and away form. As I said, they're 10 unbeaten in all competitions at home. They've only won 4 all season on their travels. So there's a real swing between what they do at Carrow Road and what they do away from home as well that needs to be readdressed, because games like Saturday, there's so much pressure on them now to win at Carrow Road because they haven't been able to do it on their travels. So not all of the issues are completely sorted, but you're right. I think there is an element that actually they've hit form when they needed to. The question mark is, as it has been all season, about what comes next.
Interestingly, I was looking at the away form table, and it's been a story of Sunderland's season alone, just how poor they've been on the road. And as you say there, the similarities between the two sides are there for everyone to see. I don't think there was any point separating the two sides away from home. So in theory, that should play into Norwich's hand this weekend, because Sunderland have been poor on the road this season.
Yeah, it's remarkably similar. And actually, you look at some of the teams who are in the top 6 hunt. I think Hull are in the top 6. I think they've taken 29 points on the road compared to Norwich City 17. Coventry as well have taken more points. West Brom have improved over the last few weeks. They were down there a couple of weeks ago. So I mentioned this season as kind of, it feels like it's been about problem solving and correcting issues that they've had, and the away form has been that Achilles heel that they've not quite been able to fix at any point. And so that does make it feel like they're so dependent on winning at home, and they've got 6 home games left, 6 away games left, 12 games, as you say. They're going to have to go basically at a rate of 2 points per game. They probably could do it by winning all of their home games, but they've got they've got an East Anglian derby to come, Sunderland as well. It puts so much pressure on what you do at home if you can't correct some of that win at home. I suspect it's inevitable. So I guess that from a Sunderland perspective, there is that opportunity there. But as you mentioned, I think Norwich have to look at this weekend, as they do all their home games, particularly after the draw against Blackburn last week, as a real opportunity to make up some ground again.
Interestingly, obviously, Jonathan Rowe's been one of the standout performers for Norwich in terms of goals, and you've touched on his absence. I mean, how big of a miss do you think that will be this weekend?
Yeah, it's a huge miss is the honest answer. I think what he's done this season has been pretty unprecedented for a young player at this level. He's got quality. He's got kind of that innate ability to kind of smell a goal from nowhere, and Norwich City's top goal scorer as it stands. But I would say it's maybe his loss has been cushioned slightly by Josh Sargent's return to form and return to playing. Although there is still a little bit of an issue there. Norwich is still managing his fitness slightly, and he's got this ankle that doesn't really know how it's going to feel day to day. So there's a possibility he could play 90 minutes on Saturday. There's a possibility he could play 60. That's kind of the difference of where they're at, and obviously the levels there are slightly different. And but it's fair to say Norwich don't quite. I mean, Borja Sainz has shown kind of flickers in recent weeks, but not consistently. Onel Hernandez is a seasoned campaigner at Championship level, but hasn't scored at home in nearly 5 years. Christian Fashnacht is someone who's chipped in with goals, but hasn't really contributed in open play. So it is them still trying to find solutions, I think, to certain issues. I mean, they've kind of counteracted that by changing a little bit what they've done centrally. Marcelino Nunez has come into a deeper midfield position. That's enabled Gabriel Sara to support Josh Sargent a little bit, and Ashley Barnes has dropped to the bench, and that's given them a little bit more control of games. And the hope is that obviously results in probably a less need for them to be as explosive on the break in the way that they have been with John Rowe in the side. So it's made them a slightly different side, but I would say at this moment in time, they've probably not felt that absence as much as maybe Norwich fans would have expected when he limped off against QPR a couple of weeks ago. Whether obviously they can sustain what they've done in the last couple of weeks to kind of muddle through, I guess, is the point of contention. But it does feel like at some point they are going to feel his absence perhaps a little bit more than they are at the moment.
So is it fair to say that Josh Sargent, has stepped up to the mantle in Rowe's absence? Is there anybody else who's performing particularly well at the minute?
I think Sargent's the one in terms of goals. Nunez, I mentioned, I think he again a deeper midfield position, but he's just enabled them to do things slightly differently. But Sargent's the talisman, really. He's the one that Norwich need to keep fit. Barnes is beginning to chip in with a bit better performances than perhaps we've seen at points this season as well. But that's, I think, largely because of what Sargent does and enables him to do as a partnership. So yeah, I think Sargent is the one. If you can stop him, then you nullify, I think, a lot of Norwich City's goal threat. Not just because they've had some real threat from wide areas as well, but I think they've almost got a blueprint in terms of what Blackburn did at the weekend in terms of nullifying Norwich from an attacking perspective. They restricted Norwich and Sargent in particular to very little. There was one chance really that he had after getting played through from Gabriel Sara. So yeah, keep Josh Sargent quiet, and I think you've got a good chance of getting something against Norwich City for sure.
Interestingly, just sort of to take it full circle, something you said at the start about Norwich and how they recruited in the summer, brought in experience. Sunderland obviously did the opposite. They shipped out the likes of Linden, Gooch, Danny Batth. How I've been, obviously Sunderland fans have been looking from afar at his season. It doesn't seem to have gone the way that I think he would have hoped, given that he spent the majority of his games on the bench. What's sort of his situation at the moment?
Yeah, I think actually the most damning kind of summation of his season has been the last couple of weeks. So against Blackburn, Grant Hanley, who's been playing as the right-sided centre-back, which is where Danny Batth has been seen at Norwich City, he came off and David Wagner actually opted to bring on Jakob Sørensen, who's a defensive midfielder, ahead of him. And, there was a couple of weeks ago as well where Gibson missed out through injury. And instead of, again, they had Danny Batth there kind of waiting. Shane Duffy's out with an injury at the moment. So they've essentially got Grant Hanley, Ben Gibson and Danny Batth as their three centre-backs. With Ben Gibson out, he went with Kenny McLean, again a central midfielder, a central defence. Sorensen started a game a few weeks ago, when Hanley was kind of struggling a little bit with a fitness issue as well, instead of going with Danny Batth. So not really seen a huge amount of him, to be completely honest. I think the last time we saw him was in a cup replay against Bristol Rovers, and he limped off with a slight hamstring issue. So you're right, it hasn't gone the way that anybody would have hoped, and I think there's been this kind of intrigue and mystery around Danny Batth for amongst Norwich fans all season, because he's been carrying around the tag of, well, this was Sunderland's player of the season last year, and he can't get a kick at the moment at Norwich. So it's hard to as you say, without being inside the training ground and watching them train every day, why that's been the case. I think there's maybe been a slight concern over his kind of distribution and that side of the game, that I think David Wagner has taken the view that maybe they're slightly better going with other options or have better options ahead of him. And yeah, he's just not really been involved, which I think has been a shame, because there was a lot of excitement, maybe not excitement, but certainly a lot of people who were pleased that Norwich City were able to sign a player of that caliber, with obviously some really high reviews from the Northeast about what he was capable of doing, but just not worked out. He's out of contract in the summer, and it feels probably unlikely that he's going to be at Norwich City beyond the end of this season, really.
As I said, it certainly feels like a strange situation looking in, because even now Sunderland fans are saying, well, he's not playing. Why did we let him go? And was it the right decision then to let him go, given he's not playing? So there's plenty of questions from a Sunderland point of view. Just in terms of, has David Wagner sort of said anything on that? Because I know obviously Norwich operate with a sporting director. Does he tend to have much of a say in the transfers?
Yeah, so again, the situation that unfolded, really, they lost Andrew Omobamidele very, very late on deadline day, and had to sign a replacement very quickly. So I can imagine the list got whittled down to people who were available in the last few hours. And Danny Batth, it was Stuart Webber at the time who was sporting director, and they had a pre-existing relationship from their time together at Wolves. So it wasn't necessarily a player that David Wagner would have asked for, know much about. I'm sure he'd have known about Danny Batth and was aware that he was maybe on a recruitment list somewhere, but maybe wasn't necessarily the first choice, or wasn't an option that he wanted, or maybe even wasn't an option that perhaps once he arrived at the club, maybe was a slightly different player to what he was expecting. Model is that signings can be made and the head coach cannot have too much of a knowledge of the players that are coming in. Norwich have made a signing this January, someone called Sidney van Hooijdonk, who you're probably more familiar with his dad Pierre, who Forest and Celtic and whatnot. And they signed him on loan from Bologna after Adamida went to Celtic on loan and hasn't really been given a kick yet. Obviously, that's largely because of what Josh Sargent and Ashley Barnes have done. But Saturday was a good example. They were chasing a game and David Wagner didn't opt to bring him off the bench. So, yeah, I think there has been a real mystery around why this Danny Batth situation has happened. I think there's probably a recognition that when Norwich have all of their centre-backs fit, Ben Gibson, Grant Hanley, Shane Duffy, Danny Batth, he's probably fourth choice in that list, to be completely honest. But there have been opportunities, particularly over the last few weeks alone, for him really to come into this team, and he hasn't done it. And that probably feels more damning than anything perhaps David Wagner could say on him and his situation.
Yeah, it certainly is a strange perspective from a Sunderland point of view anyway, looking in. Just obviously coming up to the game this weekend, how do you see Norwich approaching the game? Just from a Sunderland point of view, they've tended to struggle against sides that sit in, but with Norwich being at home, the onus will obviously be on the Canaries to take the game to Sunderland. But yeah, how do you see David Wagner's side approaching this weekend?
Yeah, Norwich, certainly in the last, Watford and Cardiff were slightly different games because they were against teams who have sat in, and Norwich are pretty similar, actually. They don't like to play teams that set up in a low block and say, go on, then break us down. I think they've been a little bit better at it in recent weeks because they've kind of suddenly got more options. They've started scoring a little bit from set pieces, but they've had kind of options with Sargent now in there to get the ball into the box a little bit earlier. So it's a different route kind of to breaking down sort of low blocks, but they're better, I think, in transition on the counter. So if Sunderland want to come to Carrow Road and have the ball, Norwich will be quite happy, I think, to let them do that, knowing that they've got the ability in transition to hurt them. And that's actually what they did in victories at home recently against Coventry, against West Brom. They were very much happy to sit in and be that kind of counter-attacking side, and with the quality of Sargent, of Rowe, as we mentioned previously, but Gabriel Sara and people like this in transition, they're happy to play Onel Hernandez. They've got pace and power to do that. So I think they'll basically be happy either way at the moment. They're in a good groove at home, and there'll be, I think, a bit more of an expectation that they're a little bit more dominant than perhaps they have been at times at home. But yeah, David Wagner is pretty happy to mix and match it. So I think they'll basically be prepared to do whatever Sunderland want them to do, really, and whatever role they want them to play. They're pretty comfortable, and as we spoke about earlier, they're in a pretty good rhythm at home. So I think they'll be feeling pretty confident heading into this one.
That's great. Thanks very much for joining me, Connor. Don't forget to head over to We Are Sunderland again, place to be for everything red and white. You can subscribe for just £1 for 6 months worth of coverage. Yeah, thanks for joining us. Thanks again, Connor.
Thanks, mate.